to make the wider case on immigration. We welcome migrants.
People to
Should
be able to
immigration
live.
be reduced?
Well, I don't believe in numbers and I don't believe in salary gaps.
We've always welcomed people to work in.
Cooper's asylum gambit, desperation disguised as reform. Before we dive into what can only be described as one of the most transparent displays of political desperation Westminster has witnessed in recent memory, make sure you hit that subscribe button. What I'm about to reveal about Yvette Cooper's latest asylum announcement will fundamentally change how you view this government approach to immigration policy, and you won't want to miss a single devastating detail of this analysis. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary who has somehow managed to make Priti Patel look decisive, has announced a major shake-up of Britain's asylum system. The timing is exquisite, coming just as Reform UK continues to surge in the polls and Labour's immigration promises lie in tatters around Westminster like confetti after a particularly disappointing wedding. Cooper's grand plan? To tighten the criteria for asylum applications and restrict family reunification rights. It's the kind of policy announcement that makes you wonder whether she's been taking lessons from Conservatives' playbook, or whether desperation has simply forced Labour to adopt the very approaches they spent years condemning as heartless and unworkable. Let's examine what Cooper is actually proposing, because the gap between the rhetoric and the reality reveals everything you need to know about how this government operates when faced with political pressure. She's promising to implement stringent new rules for family members of those seeking refuge in the United Kingdom, as part of what she calls a comprehensive overhaul of the broken asylum system. The language is carefully chosen. Broken systems require fixing, and who better to fix them than the very people who spent years insisting that previous attempts at reform were motivated by prejudice rather than practical necessity. The numbers driving this sudden conversion to immigration hawkishness are genuinely staggering. More than 20,000 people arrived in Britain through family reunification routes in the year to June 2025, representing a 30% increase from the previous year. These aren't small boat arrivals that generate dramatic headlines and social media outrage. These are legal arrivals through established immigration channels that most voters never hear about but which represent a massive challenge for public services and community integration. What makes this particularly delicious from a political analysis perspective is how it exposes the complete hollowness of Labour's previous immigration rhetoric. For years, they positioned themselves as a party of compassionate immigration policy, criticizing Conservative attempts to restrict family reunification as cruel attacks on human rights and family unity. Now, faced with the electoral consequences of their own principles, they are implementing exactly the kind of restrictions they once condemned. It's the political equivalent of a vegetarian opening a steakhouse and then expressing surprise that people expect them to serve meat. Cooper's attack on Reform UK is equally revealing and deserves careful examination. She's warning that solving the small boat crisis requires workable solutions, not impossible fantasies, which is rather rich coming from a Home Secretary whose department has presided over record-breaking channel crossings while implementing policies that can generously be described as wishful thinking disguised as border security. When politicians start attacking their critics for offering impossible fantasies, it's usually because their own workable solutions aren't actually working. The fundamental problem with Cooper's approach is that it treats the symptoms rather than the disease. Tightening family reunification criteria might reduce the numbers arriving through that particular route, but it does nothing to address the underlying factors that drive people to attempt dangerous channel crossings in the first place. It's the policy equivalent of putting a plaster on a severed artery. It might look like you're doing something, but it's not going to solve the fundamental problem. Here's what makes the situation particularly fascinating from a political psychology perspective, and if you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, you absolutely should be, because this kind of analysis is exactly why this channel has become essential viewing for anyone serious about British politics. Cooper is attempting to out-tough Reform UK on immigration while simultaneously maintaining Labour's progressive credentials on humanitarian issues. It's a political balancing act that would challenge a circus performer, and early evidence suggests she's about as successful at it as you might expect. The timing of this announcement coincides almost perfectly with the release of truly devastating statistics about small boat arrivals. Since Sir Keir Starmer took office, Britain has experienced record-breaking levels of illegal channel crossings, with over 50,000 people arriving in small boats during 2025 alone. To put this in perspective, it took Rishi Sunak's government 603 days to reach the same number of arrivals, while Boris Johnson's administration required 1,066 days to hit that milestone. Starmer has achieved this dubious record in significantly less time, suggesting that whatever his government is doing to address the crisis, it's spectacularly ineffective. Out Mehmet from Migration Watch has described this as a shocking, if inevitable, milestone, and his assessment of the government's response is particularly damning. He characterizes Labour's approach as meaningless legislation, smoke and mirrors policies, and gimmicks, which is perhaps the most accurate summary of this government's immigration strategy that we've heard from any expert commentator. The phrase thousands in none out perfectly captures the fundamental asymmetry of a policy approach that makes it easy for people to arrive but virtually impossible to remove those who shouldn't be here. The international dimension of this crisis adds another layer of complexity that Cooper's proposals seem designed to ignore entirely. The collaboration with President Macron that Mehmet references has produced precisely nothing in terms of reduced channel crossings, despite the fanfare that accompanied various bilateral agreements and joint initiatives. If anything, French cooperation appears to have decreased as the scale of British policy failure has become impossible to ignore. When your international partners start viewing your immigration policy as a joke, it becomes much harder to achieve the kind of cooperation needed to address transnational challenges. But let's examine the specific policy proposals Cooper is advancing, because the details reveal just how disconnected this government has become from the practical realities of immigration control. Stricter English language requirements sound impressive in press releases, but they are meaningless if you don't have the administrative capacity to test language skills effectively or the legal framework to remove people who fail to meet the standards. Similarly, stringent new rules for family members are worthless if the appeals process allows people to remain in the country for years while their cases are reviewed. The promise to shut down asylum hotels is particularly cynical, given that these hotels exist precisely because the government lacks adequate alternative accommodation and processing capacity. You cannot shut down hotels without either dramatically increasing processing speeds to move people through the system more quickly, or providing alternative accommodation that doesn't exist and isn't being built. Cooper's promise amounts to solving a symptom while ignoring the underlying administrative failures that created the problem in the first place. Here's where the political calculation behind Cooper's announcement becomes transparent. And make sure you're subscribed because this insight into Labour's electoral strategy is going to become increasingly important as Reform UK continues to gain ground. The government recognizes that immigration is probably the single most damaging issue for their electoral prospects, but they are attempting to address it through policy announcements rather than actual policy changes. The hope appears to be that tough-sounding rhetoric will satisfy concerned voters without requiring the kind of fundamental reforms that might actually work but will be politically difficult to implement. This approach reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both immigration policy and voter psychology. People who are concerned about immigration don't just want to hear tough talk from politicians. They want to see visible results in terms of reduced arrivals and better integration of those who are already here. Policy announcements that aren't followed by measurable improvements and outcomes actually make the political problem worse by reinforcing the perception that politicians are more interested in managing headlines than managing borders. The administrative challenges facing any attempt to reform Britain's asylum system are genuinely daunting and seem to be completely ignored by Cooper's proposals. The Home Office lacks a capacity to process applications quickly, the legal system is clogged with appeals and reviews, detention facilities are overcrowded and expensive, and removal operations face both practical and legal obstacles that make them slow and ineffective. Tinkering with eligibility criteria doesn't address any of these fundamental capacity constraints. Moreover, the international legal framework within which Britain operates severely limits the government's freedom of action on immigration policy. European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence, United Nations Refugee Conventions, and bilateral agreements all constrain what British governments can actually do, regardless of what they promise in parliamentary speeches. Cooper's proposals will need to navigate this complex legal landscape, and early indications suggest that she either doesn't understand these constraints or is choosing to ignore them for political convenience. The economic implications of current immigration levels are staggering and largely ignored in mainstream political discourse. Housing 50,000 asylum seekers in hotels costs hundreds of millions of pounds annually, but that's only the beginning of the financial burden. Processing applications, providing legal representation, delivering healthcare and education, and eventually either integrating successful applicants or removing unsuccessful ones all impose massive costs on public services that are already stretched beyond their limits. Yet Cooper's proposals offer no credible plan for reducing these costs or improving outcomes for the people trapped within the system. Tighter eligibility criteria might reduce future arrivals slightly, but they do nothing to address the enormous backlog of existing cases or improve the efficiency of processing systems that currently take years to reach decisions. It's the kind of policy announcement that sounds impressive in Parliament, but achieves nothing in practice. The comparison with other European countries reveals just how far behind Britain has fallen in terms of effective immigration control. Countries like Denmark and the Netherlands have implemented much more restrictive policies while maintaining their humanitarian credentials through better integration programs and more efficient processing systems. Britain, by contrast, combines the worst aspect of liberal and restrictive approaches, lengthy processes that satisfy neither humanitarian concerns nor public demand for control. Cooper's warning about impossible fantasies is particularly ironic given that her own proposals represent exactly the kind of wishful thinking she claims to oppose. The fantasy is that you can solve complex immigration challenges through parliamentary announcements and regulatory adjustments while leaving the fundamental structural problems unchanged. Real solutions would require massive investment in processing capacity, fundamental legal reforms, enhanced international cooperation, and politically difficult decisions about both humanitarian obligations and national sovereignty. The Reform UK surge that has prompted this latest policy announcement represents more than just a temporary protest vote against Labour's immigration failures. It reflects a fundamental realignment in British politics around issues of national sovereignty, cultural integration, and democratic accountability that mainstream parties seem unable or unwilling to address. Farage has identified a constituency of voters who feel that the entire political establishment have prioritized international obligations and progressive principles over concerns of ordinary citizens. Cooper's attempt to compete with reform on immigration policy while maintaining Labour's progressive credentials is doomed to fail because it satisfies neither constituency completely. Voters who prioritize immigration control want to see dramatic reductions in arrivals and successful removals of people who shouldn't be here. Voters who prioritize humanitarian concerns want to see compassionate treatment of asylum seekers and generous family reunification policies. Trying to satisfy both groups simultaneously produces the kind of incoherent policy approach that pleases nobody and achieves nothing. The international implications of Britain's immigration policy failures extend far beyond domestic politics and deserve serious consideration. Our European neighbors are watching Britain's inability to control channel crossings with growing frustration, as successful arrivals encourage further attempts and undermine regional cooperation on migration management. The perception that Britain has lost control of its borders affects our diplomatic relationships, our ability to influence international migration policy, and our reputation as a reliable partner in addressing transnational challenge. As Cooper prepares to address Parliament with her latest immigration proposals, one thing is abundantly clear. This represents damage control rather than genuine reform. The government recognizes that immigration policy has become an electoral liability, but their response demonstrates all the strategic thinking of a panic attack. Instead of addressing the fundamental administrative, legal, and political challenges that make current policy ineffective, they are offering cosmetic changes designed to generate favorable headlines rather than improved outcomes. The tragedy is that Britain desperately needs genuine immigration reform that balances humanitarian obligations with practical capacity, international cooperation with national sovereignty, and compassionate treatment of asylum seekers with public confidence in the system's integrity. Cooper's proposals offer none of these things. They are political theater designed to create the impression of action while avoiding the difficult decisions that real reform would require. Subscribe to UK Connors to stay ahead of this unfolding immigration crisis, because Cooper's announcements are just the beginning of what promises to be an increasingly desperate series of policy gimmicks as Labour's poll numbers continue their relentless decline. The gap between rhetoric and reality in British immigration policy is about to become even more obvious, and you won't want to miss how this story develops.